Hello and welcome back to the Developing Solutions with Sitecore Print Experience Manager video training series. In this video, we'll be covering Print Experience Manager development concepts. For the agenda, we'll do an overview understanding the InDesign Connector and the role that PXM projects play in a PXM implementation. As well, there'll be a demonstration on these basic concepts. Next, we'll do a review of the overall PXM architecture, and we'll set the groundwork for how this will fit in our overall implementation. So first off, the InDesign Connector. Well, what is the InDesign Connector? Essentially, it allows a number of operations between InDesign and Sitecore itself. First and foremost is the fact that Sitecore content is made available within Adobe InDesign. So you can see here we have our Sitecore content tree and the launch Sitecore article content. And then in turn, in the content tab within InDesign, we also have access to the Sitecore content tree. So now we're going to look at working with PXM projects. Now I will preface this by saying you can use PXM with standalone documents, and you can simply pull content from the CMS and place that into a document and update it after the fact. However, this is the developer course, so we're going to be focusing on PXM projects, which are the more advanced ways of using PXM in order to do some more advanced scenarios. So we're going to do a demonstration here, creating a very simple PXM project within InDesign. We're going to create that project structure in the project panel, and we're going to practice loading different content into that PXM project. And hopefully this will give you a bit of an understanding of the relationship between InDesign and the elements on the page, your PXM project, and the content in your Sitecore content tree. So we've loaded InDesign here, and if you haven't already, log into Sitecore within the InDesign connector in InDesign. So you can see here there's this tiny little button in the top right. I know it's quite small. This is very common within InDesign itself. Many of the user interfaces are quite small, and you can see that that's very much in keeping with the usability experience of InDesign. As a designer, you're probably used to it. As a Sitecore developer, obviously it's a little bit different. But first and foremost, we're going to log into InDesign. I'm going to log in as admin B. That's really just for the training. Everything you see here in the content tree, and similarly everything that you see in the libraries, can be restricted based upon user permissions within the CMS. So since I'm logging in as an admin, I do see everything here. Now, one of the things you'll notice, we have no Print Studio projects set up. You should see the launch Sitecore design master document that we uploaded earlier as part of the prerequisite steps. If you don't see that, go back to that video and undertake that process. This is necessary such that the styles on our page show up correctly. It would be essentially like launching a website without any of the CSS includes being published to that site. So we do need to have that. So what we're going to do first is we're going to create a Print Studio project, and what that's going to do is that's going to allow us to start to reference content from within the CMS and start to have all of these design elements stored within the CMS as well. So first off, I'm going to go and say add an item. I'm going to make this new project the PXM Training Demo Project. Now, you can see here that there's this drop down for branch. Just like in the Sitecore CMS, PXM can use branch templates as well. So if you had pre-built out projects that you would be using for things like brochures or white papers, stuff like that, you can have that as a branch template in the CMS, and those would show up here. In our case here, we just have the default, and the default is a Print Studio project. But you can see that it does build out a number of elements. It builds out this hierarchy of books, and eventually it will be documents as well. And this is really a hierarchy that InDesign itself can support. InDesign can have this concept of books and documents and pages, and so PXM supports that hierarchy as well. And that's why you're seeing a lot of this initial structure up front. Now, in order to start working with this as my working document, I'm going to drag and drop this over to this refresh area on my working project. Next, within this, I'm going to add a document. And I'm just going to call it document. And you can see here that I also have the ability to add branch templates. And similarly within pages, I'm going to add a page. And this also, again, has the ability to add branch templates. This is very common if you had different types of page layouts. So if you had 2-page brochures, 1-up spreads, fold-out brochures, etc., you would want to have those page designs stored again in Sitecore as branch templates so that you could reuse those. And I'm just simply going to say OK. And at this point, my project is complete, and I can then load that in InDesign by saying load the current item. So first off, I'm going to go to the Content tab within the plugin. And you can see the Sitecore content tree here within InDesign. And if I go to the About Launch Sitecore section and Getting Started, I can click on a content item and I can see all the fields here and in the sections that they are also in within the Sitecore CMS. And so I can then take some of these fields like the title field and I can drag and drop that on the page and I can expand that out as a title. And I can also take the abstract and drag and drop that on the page and expand this out as the abstract. And I can take the icon for that and I can drag and drop that on the page as well. And so now I've placed some articles from the Sitecore CMS onto the page within InDesign. However, these aren't part of a PXM project yet, and we'll see that and we'll do that step next. So now to take these elements that are really just static elements on the InDesign document and actually build a PXM project, you simply select the elements on the page and you drag and drop them to your project. Now in my case here, I'm going to drag and drop them to the page, and you can see here that PXM has done a few things for me. It's made what we call a snippet, and then that snippet has the title field, the abstract field, and an image frame and an image containing my icon. So there's a lot of concepts here that we have to sort of unpack. First and foremost, a snippet is basically a way of grouping content, and in general, snippets are centered around grouping content pointing to one single Sitecore content item. So for example, if I go to the Launch Sitecore site and I drag and drop that to my snippet, you can see that all the child items below that are swapped out. And so really, again, it's a grouping generally around a single Sitecore content item. So the second major concept is the fact that all of these items within my PXM project are actually Sitecore content items. So for example, there is a Sitecore content item representing a text frame that's pointing to this title field. And if I go to Sitecore here and I go to Print Studio and go down the tree, you can see that as I've been working with this document within InDesign, it has been creating and storing that information in the master database. And all of these items are here. And so I have this exact representation of what I'm working on in my working project, and in turn, the Print Studio project here in Sitecore. And if I go and I click on this title field, you'll see here that I have a whole bunch of information around the title field, but a lot of these fields, a lot of these attributes are really things that InDesign expects when it's laying out that text frame on a page. And so what the PXM project is it's really a number of Sitecore content items representing InDesign elements on the page. And a lot of these elements on the page, such as this text frame, are actually pointing to an item in Sitecore, in this case the Launch Sitecore site, and a field in that item in Sitecore in order to get the contents and put those contents onto the page. So that's the second major concept behind PXM projects. Now, the last major concept that we'll discuss is actually how this project is assembled and then in turn sent to InDesign. So if we go back to Sitecore here, you can see that we've got this XML viewer tab, and that's really because we installed that as part of the prerequisite steps. Again, if you don't have this installed, please go back and do so. This is a really important little tool for developing and in particular debugging PXM projects. If I go up to this top level PXM demo project item and I click on render deep and render this out, you can see a big giant chunk of XML, and all of this information is really the XML that's being sent to the Sitecore plugin within InDesign, which in turn is rendered into that document on the fly. And all of this result can be programmatically modified, and this is really the last key concept to understanding PXM projects. Is in our current little simple implementation, we have effectively three fields. We have our title, we have our abstract, and we have our icon. And what's happening is those are being rendered out as text frames. A text frame for the title, a text frame for the abstract, and an image frame for that final image that's being sent to the InDesign client of that end user. Now, the really important thing is each of these come from what we call a renderer. We have a text frame renderer, we have an image frame renderer, and these renderers can be customized dramatically. And so in our case here, we're just using the defaults, we're just rendering out 3 chunks of XML. But the point is that PXM doesn't really care how this XML is rendered and how it's created, and it gives you the flexibility to insert a lot of your own code and processes into this XML generation. And so this is really the true power of PXM, is the fact that all of these exist as Sitecore content items, so they can be programmatically manipulated, and we're going to do that in a workflow example. And then more to the point, all of these outputs allow us many opportunities for customization. And while our simple example here has 3 Sitecore items rendering out 3 items to our InDesign document, this can actually get much more complex. You can have renderers that will do many complex things and output that into the XML. So you can be doing things like iterating through Sitecore content trees to build out large document structures, and we're going to do that. You can be doing things like looking at data tables and building out charts based upon those data tables within InDesign. And so there's a lot of flexibility that PXM give you. And that's really kind of the third core concept behind PXM projects. So for the last part of this exercise, we're going to go back to InDesign and complete the loop here, because right now we have this very default formatting. It's quite ugly. So we're going to do one more thing, and that is to use the library and the master document that we uploaded early on in our installation process. And what this is going to do is going to allow us to apply some styling to this. And of course, styling is very important within InDesign, even more important than in the web world, some would say. And so when we first created our PXM project, we're using the default master document, and that's really a blank document with no styles whatsoever. So we're going to drag and drop over the launch Sitecore master document. We're going to close this, and we're now going to reload that project with the launch Sitecore master. Now you can see that we're already getting some formatting applied. We already have our sort of default text being rendered onto the page, and some of our actual page sizing information has changed. The launch Sitecore design uses different sizes than our default master, and so we're seeing some of those sizes here put into play. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of playing around, basically changing text frames, and we're also going to look at our styles. And so we have our paragraph styles and character styles, and I'm going to drag and drop those over. And so if we now select this text frame here and select the header 1, and we can move this over, and this is now using the body text paragraph style. And we can go back and we can save these elements as individual items. So we're going to choose and save that. And we have 2 options here. One is to save the layout back to Sitecore. So we're really overwriting writing that title text frame, and that's essentially storing the X and the Y, what style that we're using, but then we also have this option to save the content. So if I had made some text changes to the launch Sitecore site, I could push that text change back to Sitecore as well. Now, as a developer, you want to be really concerned about this, right? You want to understand where the source of truth is and who is ultimately responsible for editing text and pushing those changes back to Sitecore. So if your designers are responsible for making those text changes and you want that change to apply to the web, then yes, you want to enable the ability to save content and push that back to Sitecore. If your web people and the people in charge of entering that content into Sitecore are ultimately responsible for the approval of that content and ensuring that content's correct, and you don't want designers to push that back to Sitecore, this can be disabled. And this can be disabled within PXM entirely, or this can be done on a permission basis. So that is to say, the user that's logging into InDesign doesn't have the ability to save the content back to the CMS. In our case here, we're just saving the layout. And that's also true for this abstract. We're going to save the layout. And also the icon, we're going to save the layout. So all these changes are being saved back to Sitecore. So to make sure these changes to the layout actually went back to Sitecore, we can go to our page item and we can choose to reload that page. And if we miss something, we would see the old formatting appear here. Since we're not seeing the old formatting, we didn't miss anything. Everything's good. Similarly, we can go back to Sitecore and we could go to, say, this title field item and go to the content. And if we scroll down, you'll see that our properties have changed. But more importantly, you want to go to the paragraph style property. And you can see here that header 1 is being used. So that means that this header 1 for that paragraph style was in fact taken from that InDesign document and applied to that item within Sitecore. Okay, next, I'm just going to very quickly grab a few more items from the content tree and put them onto the page. So this launch Sitecore site item, I'm going to make this change and I'm going to make the header slightly smaller. And I'm going to do that such that I can insert a person's name in this space here. So I'm going to go to the team node within the Sitecore content tree and go to Chris Castle, and I'm going to drag this image of Chris onto the page. And you can see here that the placement of this image is actually separate from this frame itself. And that's really how InDesign works with images and frames. So I'm going to move this around a little bit. And then in turn, I have my underlying image of Chris within that. So those two things are separate concepts within InDesign. And that's a little bit ugly, but I'm keeping that there as a reminder of the difference between an image frame and an image. Second, I'm going to go to job title and I'm going to drag and drop that across as well. So this is Chris's job title. And then the title in this case is actually his name. And so I've got these three fields, his name, his job title, and his image. And I'm going to select all three. Now last time we went and we dragged and dropped this to the page element. And if we're going to do that again this time, and that will create a new snippet. Now remember before I said a snippet is really a grouping of content and referring to, generally speaking, a single Sitecore content item. So we're going to go to our old snippet and we're going to rename this the article, because that's actually what we're pulling down from Sitecore. We're pulling down articles. And then this new snippet here, if I double click on it, this will select all the elements, and this is actually an author. If I want to add some fields after the fact, so let's say Chris has this quote and I want to add that, I'm going to drag and drop that. Oops. I drag and drop that over some existing text. So let's make sure we don't do that. So we have our quote here. And if I want to add this to an existing snippet, it's simply a case of dragging and dropping that over to that existing snippet. So I now have my article, which is here, and my author, which is here. I can take a different author and again drag and drop that over so we see Brandon Royal. I can take a different article, so what is content, and drag and drop that over to the article, and we can see that we're basically having the same document structure, the same styles, the same text frames, the same image frames, but we're piping in different content, and we're doing that by virtue of dragging and dropping that over to a snippet. And so this is a really simple implementation. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through and make this a more advanced implementation, because this actually has some problems. The first is that within Sitecore, if you go to Sitecore and go to one of the articles, you can see that in general, the articles themselves are already tagged with contributors. And the way they are here in InDesign, they're separate. So first we're selecting the article, then we're selecting the author, and those two actually aren't linked. And so what we want to do is programmatically devise a way to link these things so that when we do drag and drop over a new article, it actually automatically pulls the contributor associated with that article and puts that onto the page. And so we're going to start doing that in our next exercises. But first we're going to do a review of the PXM projects in general and how these final document outputs are assembled and sent to InDesign. So let's review. So first off, when would you need to use a PXM project? Well, this is really when your solution requires more automated publishing, or when a group of people needs to work on InDesign documents simultaneously or in workflow. So by looking at that structure, you should be able to determine a few things. The first off is that we are separating out our content from our presentation, just like Sitecore does for web publishing. So our presentation lives as items within the PXM project, and the content is just simply referring to Sitecore content items. In our case here, we are sharing those Sitecore content items between print and web. You may choose to have separate items, obviously, if your purposes are different. But in general, this gives us a degree of control. So it means that people can be working on the design while other people are working on the content. That's a pretty useful thing. Secondly, it means that a lot of these elements can be applied in workflow. So we can be workflowing the content. We can also be workflowing the design. Next, a PXM project allows a number of elements of programmability. So first and foremost, the items can be easily programmatically manipulated. So as we go through some of our examples further in this course, we're going to be taking base projects that we build up and adding more complexity and adding more complexity. And that's just done by copying PXM projects, which are Sitecore items. Next, we're also going to be able to use workflow, which means that PXM projects are created on demand and on the fly. Lastly, it allows us to do things like personalization. And so we haven't quite gotten into that yet, but in the same way that an InDesign designer is selecting content and pushing that content onto the page, you can be using Sitecore context and the users and information in XDB to be determining what content goes onto that page and be building PDFs to send to users automatically. And so really what we've just done is touched on sort of the kernel of the core concepts of what PXM projects enable, and we'll be taking and going through all those examples as we go on. So again, looking at that PXM project structure, we have, at a high level, we have books. Within that, we have documents, and within that, we have pages. In general, the majority of PXM projects simply have one document with multiple pages within that document. However, because InDesign itself supports those concepts for advanced publications, we choose to support that as well. Within a page contains snippets. All of your layout items text frames, image frames, rectangles, ellipses, whatever, regardless of the source of the content, regardless of whether or not they're linked to Sitecore items, they have to live within snippets. And a snippet contains those page objects. So again, page, snippet, page objects within that. Lastly, how this is married up with the master document. So an InDesign document itself contains everything. It has the formatting, it has content, it has styles, it has links to those underlying source assets, so those images that we were using. And for review, it's used in desktop publishing to create books and magazines, newspapers. The master document has the blanks, essentially all those style settings like paragraph styles and character styles and all those definitions. And so what PXM does is it basically gets the content from Sitecore in the Sitecore content tree, the page layout information from the PXM project, the page styling information from the master document, and all of the assets that go along with that, and it combines all of those, and that's what gets sent to InDesign in order to open up that document that has all of those elements.